Thanks again for dog sitting.
No worries.
They're really smart. They'll do whatever you tell them. Oh, and there's a ton of Bud Light in the fridge. Here we go.
Hey, guys.
There's a whisker in my hamburger.
Guys, we need more mugs.
Here we go. Don't worry, guys. I got it.
I need some dogs like that. I'm telling you. Woo! So how many of you would say that you talk to God? Yeah? All right. Okay. That's good. And let me ask you this. How often do you talk to God? How many would say you would say that you talk to God once in a while? Okay. How many of you would say that you talk to God pretty often? All right. How many would say really, really often? Okay. And how many would say all the time? Okay. All right. Good. Yeah, I think that's probably pretty good answers. And so let me ask you this question then. Would you say that talking to God is prayer, or that prayer is talking to God? Yeah, it's a kind of a toss-up, ain't it? Actually, I guess I'd have to say that prayer is more closely linked to worship than it is to actually just simply talking to God. The fact is, the Greek word for worship is really, really closely associated with prayer, because with prayer, one of the definitions for prayer has worship in it, or several definitions for prayer have the word worship in it. So worship is really, really closely related to prayer, or that prayer is really closely related to worship, whichever way you want to say that. And so the fact is that worship itself means to give homage to, or to bow to, or even actually to kiss the hand, most literally, like your dog kisses your hand when you come home, or we're so happy to see you, where the tail wags the dog, all that kind of stuff. That's more like what that is. That's more like what that's about. So that means that worship not only comes from how we feel inside about God, but worship is simply the event itself. It really isn't what worship is. It's the event, but it's not the words that go with the event. That's what prayer is for. That's what the word prayer in the original means, is that those are the words that we use as we worship God. Worship is the event, while prayer seems to be the words of worship, or the words that we use when we talk to God. As a matter of fact, that's exactly why I like to talk about this, or I like to refer this time that we spend together as a worship experience, not as a worship service. Worship service is that more religious sounding word, and yet worship service has the idea that we're here to serve God somehow, as though God needs us to serve Him by being here. That's not the case at all. That has absolutely nothing to do with it. We're not here to serve God in that sense. We're here to worship God. And to worship God, we use words of worship. And actually, that's probably really close to what I would say that I do up here every Sunday morning, is that we talk about God, we talk about how awesome God is, about who God is, about what He does, about how He feels about us, all those different kinds of things. That's really what talking to God, or what prayer is really all about. So worship really has nothing to do with serving God or any of those kind of things. Prayer is the words that we use as we worship God. And so worship really comes from the condition of the heart. It comes from out of what we feel on the inside of us. And often, I wouldn't say all the time, but often it manifests itself in the words that we say and the words that we use. So let me just welcome you to, this actually is week number 4 of our series called Here We Go. And the reason I've called it that is because, well, you saw the commercial, because that's really what prayer is about us just loving God so much and wanting to be with God so much that it's really like your dog, that when you come home, he's just so happy to see you, he can't hardly stand it. That's really what prayer really is a lot about. So today we're going to be talking about So let me ask you this question. What is the most basic use for words? I mean, what do we use words for? Well, of course we use words to communicate with each other, don't we? We use words to communicate with each other. That's what we use words. That's what words are for. As a matter of fact, it really doesn't make any difference whether we communicate anger or fear or disappointment, or whether we communicate love or admiration or awe or any of those kind of things, it's still communication, isn't it? Doesn't matter what kind of communication it is, doesn't matter what the words might be or how we might feel at the moment, words are still words, and that's what we use to communicate how we feel towards each other or with each other. So words are what we use to communicate the deepest, hopefully, the deepest feelings and ideas that we have in our hearts with each other. And it really doesn't matter even if you're deaf, right? Or you can't speak for some other reason, other physical reason, whatever that case might be. Words are still what we use to communicate how we feel. How those words are put down, it may be by typing, it may be by text, it may be by a lot of other things, but at least the words are what we use to communicate how we feel with each other. So it really doesn't matter, all those different kind of things that we talk about communication. So let me show you a really striking example out of the Bible about what the lack of communication can do, how the lack of communication can destroy an entire civilization. I want to give you an example from the Bible where words, the lack of communication, can literally destroy an entire civilization. Way back in the Old Testament book of Genesis, which is way, way back there, ain't it? That's the very first book in the Old Testament. We read about a time when the whole earth was using the same language and spoke the same words. Anybody tell me when that was? Before the Tower of Babel. That's right. That's right. Before the Tower of Babel is when that was. So before the Tower of Babel, everyone spoke the same language. Everybody used the same words. Everybody the entire world over was able to communicate with each other without any problem. And since everybody spoke the same language, God said, He said, behold, they are one people, and they all have the same language, and this is what they began to do. Of course, they began to build the Tower of Babel, and now nothing which they purpose to do will be impossible for them. There's a lot of descriptive words there. Nothing that they decide to do will be impossible for them. So let me ask you, is that a good thing or a bad thing? Well, I guess it depends on how you look at it. Because the fact is, it would be ridiculous to think or to say that God was somehow afraid that now that they all speak the same language and all those kind of things, that nothing will be impossible for them. It would be ridiculous to say that God is really upset or is afraid that they might actually be able to reach to heaven with their tower and finally be able to look in God's face and discover who God really is, right? A couple of problems with that. Number one is God afraid for us to find out who He is? And number two is, do you think it would be possible to build a tower tall enough to reach into heaven and actually look into God's face? No. No. No on both counts. We've been to the moon. We've got satellites that go way, way, way out in our universe, our solar system. And I think, quite honestly, I think that's what they're really in the deepest part of their beings, whether they know it or not. I think they're searching to see if God really exists. I thought about showing you that clip from Star Trek where they do actually find God. I showed it to you a while back, and I decided not to use it again here today, but it's really interesting about finding God, and then finding out God isn't who you thought He was. Well, I think that's the whole idea here is that instead of God being afraid that they might actually get a look at His face and of course I've heard some say that, well, if they ever did get to look at God's face, it would have just killed them, because you can't, God says nobody can look at me and live, nobody can see my face and live. Well, okay, but I don't think that's a problem at this point. Instead, what I believe is that God was saving them from the utter disappointment of not finding God at the end of their universe. God was saving them the problems and the utter disappointment of actually not being able to find Him at the end of their universe. I mean, they would have built a tower as tall as they could get it, and they would say, well, we're there. And God still isn't here. Where is God? Is there a God? All those different kind of things. So who can tell me what God did to break up their little party? He confounded, well, that's the word I used, confounded their language, right? As a matter of fact, God said, come, let us go down, and there confuse their language so that they will not understand one another's speech. Well, obviously what happens then is that once they can't understand each other's speech, they've got a problem. So did they stay together? No, they couldn't stay together, as a matter of fact. They weren't able to stay together because they couldn't understand each other. They couldn't understand the language each other was speaking. So the next verse tells us that, so the Lord scattered them abroad over the face of the whole earth, and they stopped building the city. Well, of course they did. They weren't able to get along. They weren't able to talk to each other. They didn't know what each other was doing. All those different kind of things, and it was just ridiculous. So God scattered them over the face of the whole earth by causing them not to be able to communicate with each other. And once they couldn't communicate with each other, the party was over, man. It's done. It's over with. So when God made it impossible for them to communicate each other, they didn't have any choice but to, well, maybe band together with the few people that they could find that maybe did speak their same language and go start, their own little town somewhere else. So let me ask you this question. Would you say that communication is important? I mean, could we live without communication? Does it really matter whether we communicate with each other or not? Well, yes, it does, as a matter of fact, doesn't it? Well, why? Well, because without communication, relationship is impossible. Without communication, relationship is impossible because communication builds relationship. So if you got a pen or you want to, or stick it in your mind, put it in your iPad or your iPhone or whatever, communication builds relationship. The fact is, communication builds relationship in the same way that the lack of communication between those who even speak the same language, even though we may speak the same language, the lack of communication between us really breeds contempt and fosters, a resentment and all those kind of things, and actually just causes us to go our separate ways. If we don't communicate with each other, we're going to go our own way. We're going to find somebody else that we can communicate with, and that's the simple fact of the matter. Communication builds relationship, and without communication, there is no relationship. Simple as that. The fact is, without communication, and I think you'll see as we talk about this for a moment, that without communication, the only thing that you're left with is nothing more than mere guesswork as to what the other person is thinking, what the other person is feeling, what the other person wants, what the other person might need. Without spoken words, the only other avenue left to us is trying to figure out what the other person feels like, or what the other person is thinking, or what they might want or need, simply by looking in their face, checking their face out. What's the look on their face? How do they feel? The attitude of their body, the actions that they take. All those different kind of things is all we have left then to decide what a person is feeling or thinking or has on their mind at the time. Of course, when that happens, if that's the only thing that we are left with, if the only thing that we're left with is the look on the other person's face, or the body actions they have, or the actions they take in their life, or whatever the case might be, a vast majority of the time we're going to come to the wrong conclusion, aren't we? Because we really don't know what they're thinking. We know what they're doing, we know what their face looks like, but all those things can be very deceiving. I think you already know that that's one of the major problems that veterinarians have, right? I mean, a veterinarian has to work on animals, and they can't tell you how they feel, or where it hurts, or what they're thinking, or what they're afraid of, or any of those kind of things. You just kind of have to discover that for yourself, Now, I got to tell you, I've got this little blue Lacey dog. I say little, she's a medium-sized dog. I've had a couple of blue Laceys in my lifetime. I like blue Lacey dogs. They're pretty, and she looks exactly like that. That's not her. I was really surprised, but I think she even has a red collar. But see the little white stripe on her chest, and then she also has white toes The tips of her toes are white, and all blue laces look just almost exactly the same. Real pretty dogs. But when she needs out to go water the grass, if you know what I mean, when she wants to get outside to go water the grass, she'll run to the door and she wags her tail and she paws at the door and she looks back at me and she paws the door a little bit, wags her tail and acts a little anxious, you know, and so I get up and go let her out. Well, when she wants back in, she's learned how to open the sliding glass door, so that's not a problem. She just walked, and she's good at it. She walks up to the sliding glass, she must be left-handed. She walks up to the sliding glass door, and the door slides that way when you're on the outside, and she takes her left foot and she just goes, and walks right in. No problem. If you don't keep the glass door shut and locked, she will open the door. Just simple as that. Let herself in. I don't know if she turns on the AC and stuff yet or not. I haven't figured that out. But she does a pretty good job, all that other stuff. Well, the interesting thing about Harley, her name is Harley. The interesting thing about Harley is that she's a little smarter than that even, because we have 3 other dogs. And sometimes, and they came along after she did, and so she doesn't like the divided attention, you know what I mean? She wants to be the center of attention. She doesn't want the other guys bothering her, you know, or all that kind of stuff. So she'll get up sometimes and she'll run to the door and she paws at the door and, you know, crosses her legs and all that and looks at me, you know, because what the fact is she's learned that when she goes out, everybody else goes out too, except that they're a lot more bolder than she is, because they'll just bowl her over to get out. So she goes to the door and she paws at the door like that, and you go to the door and open the door, and the other 3 dogs go out the door, and she just goes, smiles and turns around, goes, lays back on the couch. Yep. The problem is, I can't tell when she's lying. You know, if she wants out, it's a good idea to let her out. She might have to go potty. But then again, she might just be wanting the other dogs out. But you can't take that chance, you know what I'm saying? You gotta let her out anyhow. But I just can't tell when she's lying. So communication then, even in that kind of communication builds relationship. I discovered early on in ministry, and I've been in ministry now for longer than I want to talk about, 30 years I guess. And when you speak in front of a crowd, I learned early on that when you speak in front of a crowd, one of the hardest things to overcome is the looks on people's faces. You know what I'm saying? Of course, now I really need to have glasses to see y'all real clear, so it's not near as much problem. But yeah, I can see that. Yeah, thanks, man. Yeah, I appreciate it. But when I was younger, I would go home Sunday after Sunday just depressed and feeling really terrible because somebody made a really bad face at something that I had said. And I thought, man, what did I say? You know what? Oh man, I must have really hurt their feelings because they looked horrible, and I just feel so bad. Later on, I realized that they probably just had gas. Or the person next to them had gas, you know? I'm sure you heard about that old couple was sitting in church, older couple sitting in church, and she was sitting there, said the preacher went overtime like usual, you know, like he always does, and she was getting tired. Finally, she kind of leaned over to her husband, and she said, you know, my butt's asleep. He leaned back over to her and said, I know, I heard it snore 3 times. Goodness, I'm telling you. But you know, seriously, there really is no way of knowing for sure what our others are thinking until they actually express it with words. And if you've had any kind of training or anybody's ever talked to you about communicating with others, one of the things that they tell you to do is that even when you're talking to somebody and they say, this is what I'm thinking, you know, the best thing to do is to repeat their words back to them, or to talk back to them and say, if I understand you, this is what you are saying, right? Because a lot of times what they'll do is they'll say, no, that's not what I meant at all. Is that what that sounded like? No, that's not what I meant, you know? So communication is extremely important because communication builds relationship. And without communication, there can't be relationship. And that's why prayer, the words of worship that we use, the words that we use to talk to God and to tell God what's on our heart and what's in our mind are so important as well. Because communication builds relationship. And again, it really doesn't matter when you talk to God, when you're talking with God, whether you communicate, fear or anger or disappointment or love or admiration or awe or even if we're just flat pissed off and using language that we would never use, like they say, do you use that mouth to kiss your mother? It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. God can handle that. If he can't handle that, he ain't much of God. You need to communicate with God in the words that you use that express what is in your heart and what is in your life, no matter what those words may sound like to others. We're not talking to others. We're talking to God here, right? That's what matters. That's what matters. Words are what we use to communicate with God. So it doesn't matter if we say those words out loud or whether we think them in our heart. Or even if we can't even actually find the right words to say. God knows. He hears. And that builds our relationship with him. And I think that's exactly what Paul was talking about in 1 Thessalonians 5:17 when he said, pray without ceasing. In other words, talk to God all the time. Talk to God all the time. No matter what's on your heart, no matter what you have to say, no matter what you're thinking, tell God about it. It's okay. It doesn't matter what the words are, how you're feeling, what's going on in your life. He wants to hear about it. He wants to hear about it. He wants to hear from you. And I know you want to hear from him as well. So that means to me that God wants us to talk to him not just when we feel good, but when we don't feel so good. When we're happy with him and when we absolutely hate his guts. Tell him that. It's okay. He can handle it. He's not me. You tell me that, I might not be able to handle it quite as well. Although I've been told that a few times. I hate your guts. Okay. God can handle that. God knows how to handle that. We need to talk to him when we're happy as well as when we're sad. Well, when we're feeling so bad that we don't think we can put one foot in front of the other. God wants us to talk to him when we have everything that we could ever possibly want or need, when life is going wonderful and it's all a bed of roses, as well as when we don't really know where we're going to get the next meal. Both of those times are times that we ought to be talking to God about it. Because communication builds relationship. Have you ever stopped to notice that the people you seem to feel the closest to are the same people whom you've been through the most with? You ever notice that? I mean, people that you've been through some really, really hard times with, together. You've done some stuff, you've been there, you've done that, you've supported each other, you've backed each other, you've done all that stuff, and I'll tell you what, when you come out the other side, you're brothers, man. You're brothers. It's almost like, no, blood ain't thicker than water, You're brothers. The fact is, after World War II had ended and the soldiers were sent back home to assume their normal civilian lives, the humdrum of every day, working in the factory or plowing the fields or whatever it was they did, many of the guys began to miss the camaraderie of depending on their fellow soldiers just to stay alive. They began to miss that. As one writer said, these men became brothers born of warfare, atrocity, and death, a kinship that runs deeper than blood relations. Some of you know what that's like. Some of you can relate to that directly. So it should come as no surprise, especially like after World War II, and after any war for that matter, that those men back then returned stateside and assumed they're punching their time clocks and plowing the fields or whatever it was that they did, and so they started to look for something that would get their blood pumping again, of course. So it wasn't long before motorcycles got into the scene, came into the scene. This is a fact, man. This is history. Mostly due to the high level of performance of the motorcycles, as well as the excitement that riding a motorcycle offers, all that kind of stuff. You know what I'm talking about, you guys. You know what I'm talking about. As well as for the relatively antisocial characteristic of, loud pipes and, riding on the road. You may be together, riding in a pack or a gang or a club, but you're riding by yourself too, So there's a relatively antisocial sort of a thing about that as well that appeals to guys especially, gals too. So with that thought in mind then, have you ever thought about how much you and God have been through together in life? I know you don't like to think about it that way because you like to think that, well, those times that, things were really going bad, God wasn't there. I beg to differ with you. God says He will never leave you or forsake you. He's always there. He loves you no matter who you are, what you do, where you go, how you act. Doesn't matter. He loves you anyway because you're His child, just like you love your children no matter where they go, what they do, how they act, what they get into. You hate it for them, but you still love them just as much as ever. So have you ever thought about how much you and God have been through together in your lifetime? A lot, huh? A lot. So my question is then why are we often still mad at Him instead of feeling closer to Him? If on a human level we feel closer to each other when we go through a lot of adversity together and a lot of problems, a lot of difficulties, and because we depend on each other and those kind of things, and we come out the other side as brothers. Why is it that when it comes to God and all the things that we've been through with God in our lifetime, because God has always been there, why is it that I find myself sometimes still being mad at Him because, even though we've been through, I think it's because, here's my opinion, I think it's because we often think that prayer is getting God to do stuff for us. We like to think about prayer as being that thing, that avenue by which we get God to do stuff for us and or for our loved ones. But you got to know that prayer is primarily communication. Prayer is primarily communication with God. Talking to God about what's on your heart and what's in your life, what's happening to you at the moment. And knowing that we live in this world where stuff happens. Your fault, my fault, God's fault, nobody's fault. Stuff happens, man. That's the world we live in. And we can't be constantly blaming God because He doesn't change the nature of reality for me. If He changes the nature of reality for me, then He has to do that for you and for everybody else until pretty soon we'll have a perfect world again. Wouldn't that be wonderful? But we don't live in a perfect world. We live in a world where bad stuff happens to good people. And God says, I am always there to see you through it. I am always there with you, even in the midst of adversity. Not necessarily to get you out of adversity, but with you in the midst of adversity. To help you through, to be with you when nobody else can be. Ever ended up in the hospital and not have a single person close enough to you that would be willing to stay with you? Not fun, is it? You read about the guys in the prison camps who have absolutely nobody. And they come out the other side saying, you know what? God was always there. That's who we are. Prayer is primarily communication with God. Staying connected with God about every and each and every moment, each and everything that happens within our lives, talking to God about it each and every day, whatever it is, good or bad, knowing that He's there and He hears us. Whether we're angry or sad or filled with everything that we have or in want, still not having anything. Just talk to God about it. It's okay. Because communication builds relationship. And God is all about being in relationship with you and you in relationship with Him. Is God awesome or what? God bless you all. Lord bless you.